Hello everyone, I'm Aaron, a breeding naturalist. Welcome back. I'm here on the rocky Pacific coast of Northern California. Let's go tide pooling. So tide pools form in a zone called the intertidal zone, which basically means the area below the highest high tide but above the lowest low tide. So a place on the shore where during high tide it's mostly covered with water, but at low tide it's mostly exposed to air. Now it might seem like if an organism was going to live in that zone, it would be faced with all of these complex and difficult to deal with conditions. Sometimes it'd have to be underwater. Sometimes it'd have to be in the air. Sometimes salinity levels would change. It would have to be pounded by rocks. Sometimes it would be hot. Sometimes it'd be cold. It seems a really harsh place to live. And yet, despite all those harsh conditions, the intertidal zone is teeming with life. So many organisms of so many different types of animal have found a way to live somewhere in that zone of intertidal area. It can be an incredibly biodiverse zone to explore and really, really fun. You never know what you're going to find. So we're going to spend a little bit of time today poking around, seeing what we can see. Tide pooling, we found some really amazing animals, just great creatures. As we first started to explore the intertidal zone, we came across lots of black turban snails, which are an incredibly common intertidal species, one of the most abundant marine snails around. In fact, people have done studies on these things to see just how dense they get, and there can be as many as 1,400 snails in just a 1 square meter area of rocky intertidal habitat. So they can get to be incredibly common, incredibly dense. They're really cool. And they're snails, they cruise along, moving slowly. As we looked closer, though, we found that some of those snail shells weren't moving quite like snails. And that's because those snail shells have become home to hermit crabs. Hermit crabs are a species of crab, actually a suite of species, that have evolved to live inside the shells of other organisms. So usually these are mollusks, things like snails, very common. And what happens is a snail will die, or another shelled organism dies. The soft tissue is all eaten away or rots away, and the shell is left behind. And that becomes a valuable resource. Hermit crabs have evolved to live inside the shells, to adopt abandoned shells, to protect sort of softer parts of their body. So they fit snugly inside that shell, and then carry it around with them as their protection. Now, this means that periodically, as that hermit crab grows, it's got to find new shells, because the shell, of course, doesn't grow with the hermit crab. The shell is the size that it is when the mollusk died. That's it. It's done. And so the hermit crab, as it gets bigger, it gets tighter and tighter fit inside of that shell. And so eventually it has to give that shell up and go find a different shell. Hermit crabs often fight over shells because they're sort of a limited resource, and they become this high priority, very high value resource worth fighting over for a growing hermit crab. Farther down the intertidal zone, we come to beds of predominantly 2 different organisms mixed together. They're mussels and they're gooseneck barnacles. Gooseneck barnacles are these fascinating organisms that in their larval stage are actually free swimming. Larval barnacles out swimming around, doing their thing in the water column. But as they reach maturity, they go through a metamorphosis where they sort of face head down onto a rock or other hard surface and fuse themselves kind of upside down to that surface and build armored shells around themselves for protection. And so gooseneck barnacles are just like this. They have kind of a stalk, it's a little bit softer, and then these hard plates or shells over much of their body. And then that allows them, because remember, they're basically head down, that allows them to extend their legs out into the water to pull and filter out food particles from the passing waves. So it was really cool to be able to actually see the waves come in and these barnacles extend their legs upside down into the water to pull out food. Also, while poking around amongst the rocks, we found porcelain crabs. Now, porcelain crabs, despite the name, are actually not true crabs. They're more closely related to lobsters, and they're called porcelain crabs because they're very fragile. I didn't even try to pick any of these up because when you do, they very often just have limbs that break off. And so I just didn't want to mess with them at all. But you can see some of them scurrying around the rocks. There are about 4,000 different species of porcelain crab around the world. And they're often really beautiful, and they have this really cool characteristic shape where almost all of them are evolved to be sort of flat, so they can easily live amongst the rocks. Of course, when you're down tide pooling, you're going to see algae and seaweed of lots of different kinds. And in particular, one of the ones that struck me this time around were these sea palms. Sea palms are actually a species of kelp, and they're a really interesting kelp because they're one of the few species of seaweed that are actually sort of sturdy enough and robust enough to remain upright even out of water. So that makes them interesting. Another thing that makes them interesting is they are delicious. In fact, they are so delicious that there are regulations in place that limit the timing and the volume and how many people could possibly go out and harvest sea palm. In fact, it's limited quite to very small amounts because they are such a highly prized commodity for food by us humans. Delicious source of seaweed. So a really fun species of seaweed, of kelp, to see in the intertidals. Another species that we found of an entirely different group of organisms are these aggregating anemones. This is the most common species of anemone anywhere on the Pacific coast, especially in rocky areas. There are thousands of them all over the place, and they're called aggregating anemones because they form these groups. They tend to aggregate, and part of that is because of how they reproduce. These most commonly reproduce in a form of asexual reproduction called cloning or budding, where one fully grown adult anemone will split itself in half and become two anemones. And those two grow up, put on some size, and then split themselves. And then you've got four, and et cetera, et cetera. These things just sort of keep aggregating, cloning themselves, budding off. And so it's a really interesting reproductive strategy. These also are interesting because, in part, some of their green color comes from an algae that lives inside of their tissues. These algae are called zooxanthella. And there's a really interesting mutualistic interaction that happens between the anemone and the zooxanthella. The zooxanthella are photosynthetic, so they can actually take in light and turn it into sugars, like a plant. And they give some of those nutrients to the anemone. So the anemone gets a nutrient boost, and in exchange, the anemone houses and keeps safe these colonies of zooxanthella in their tissue. So a very interesting mutualistic interaction. Another species of crab that we saw, these ones being true crabs again, are the lined shore crabs. Really pretty with these very fine, sort of delicate lines across their bodies. Another really common species found throughout the intertidal. They range from sort of Oregon down to Baja, so sort of across the California coast. And these are crabs that eat, almost anything. Like so many crabs, these things will scavenge for dead organic matter. They eat algae, they'll eat snails, they'll eat small fish if they can get a hold of them, they'll eat other crabs, and they'll eat just about anything they can get a hold of. Interestingly, these don't defend specific territories. They all are sort of free-ranging, wandering around just looking for food. But very fun to see. Another very exciting find that we found while tide pooling is a Gumboot chiton. Gumboot chitons are the largest chiton in the world. They're super cool. But what is a chiton? Well, chitons are basically armored slugs. They are a mollusk, so they're related to slugs and snails. They don't have like a snail shell, a whorled shell. Instead, they have a body that's kind of laid out very slug-like, sort of long and slender, with these armored plates, usually 8 of them, along their back. And those plates are articulated so the Gumboot chiton can curl up and protect itself if it ever has to. These things can live to be up to 40 years of age, so they can get to be really old, and they're just a really exciting find to come across. Really interesting, odd looking. And they're odd looking even for chitons because, those plates that I mentioned, on most chitons, those plates are completely visible. You can look down at a chiton and see those articulated armored plates on their back. Gumboot chitons are odd though, because their tissue actually completely covers up the plates, so you can't actually see them. But they're embedded. If you press on them, you can feel these hard things kind of under a layer of tissue. So they're not visible, but they are definitely there. Armored slugs, the Gumboot chiton. Another really exciting and beautiful find was this sea lemon. Sea lemons are nudibranchs. This is another mollusk. Again, it's a sea slug, but a gorgeous one. Nudibranchs, there are many, many different species found around the world. They're all gorgeous, crazy colors, amazing patterns. And this one, the sea lemon, is one that I found while tide pooling that is really common across much of the eastern Pacific Ocean. They graze on sponges largely, and they, as so often have, they have this warning coloration. These bright colors mean that they're actually dangerous. What lots of nudibranchs do, these special kinds of sea slugs, is they will eat, among other things, anemones. Anemones have stinging cells in them. And so what the nudibranchs can do is they can eat these stinging cells, not trigger them to sting themselves, and instead exude them onto their own skin, onto the surface of their own bodies, and then use them as a defense. So they're kind of hijacking the evolutionary defensive capabilities of an entirely different group of organisms and grabbing it off of them and using it for themselves. Fascinating and gorgeous animals. What fun, what amazing discoveries, what amazing animals and other creatures to see while tide pooling out here. So many different animals, so many different strategies for how to deal with this harsh condition of the intertidal zone, this transition between land and water. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you had as much fun as I did. As always, thank you very much for the view. And until next time, enjoy the natural world.